Hello everyone. We are working this week on tutorial 4.1 and 4.2 in our GIS tutorial 2 book, and I thought I've had several people call with some questions and a few issues and such while working through the exercise, so I thought I would do another video here on it and just try to walk you through some of the steps as it appears on my screen, and we'll see if that helps. And with the when I open up tutorial 4.1, this is what I get on my computer. Hopefully you're getting something like this as well. And just to point out, I notice a few differences as I go through some of the tutorials in this book. There are a few differences occasionally in what you see when you open up a project versus what the book is showing. And just be aware that there are so many settings with the ArcGIS program, and you can customize that program as well. And so you might have a slightly different look to your screen than what you're seeing in the book. It shouldn't be too drastic, and for many of you it will look just like the book. But just be aware that some of the changes and settings you make to ArcGIS are perpetuated into the future. In other words, it retains those settings. So that might explain some of the differences. For example, toolbars, different toolbars. Like on my screen, you'll notice that I've got a toolbar called Xtools Pro, and you likely won't have that. That's just because that's an optional program that I had purchased at a later date, and it has its own toolbar on here. And so, the toolbars in particular may look a little bit different. And so it's just something you'll have to deal with. It's actually a benefit in the long run, but when you're learning in the beginning, it may be a little bit of a problem because we're hoping that things will look exactly like the book, and that's not always going to be the case. So that may explain part of the differences. And then there are a few little glitches in the book I've noticed as well. For example, and pardon me if I've got a little bit of a cold this week, so. But if you switch the view, like notice my project opened up in data view by default, and I noticed in the book, their picture looks like what you would see, at least on page 103. It looks like what you would see in the layout view. So I switched over to the layout view just for curiosity, and I notice mine looks similar, except I'm missing in this area that I'm moving the mouse. I'm missing the legend that they're showing in the book. Okay, and that's just a glitch on the author's part, I would assume. I thought it might have been hidden behind this graphic, but I checked and it's not there. And the way I checked, by the way, and I'll show you a few of these things just to maybe add a little bit more, I guess, to what he's saying in the book that might help you with using the program a little bit. But everything's a graphic in this legend. If I select it by left clicking, you'll notice I get the blue boxes around the edge of it. And I can right click while that's selected, and I get this pop-up, and one of the options is order. And you notice you've got several orders. One of them is to send things to the back. And just on a hunch, that thinking that the legend might have been hidden behind this gray box and somehow gotten moved to the back, which would explain why I wasn't seeing it, I went ahead and moved this gray box, which is selected now, to the back. So I click send to the back, and hoping I would see the legend pop up here, but I did not. So I'm assuming that it's not there. Remember, you can also undo a lot of things. So another way to check for that would be just to delete this graphic temporarily. So while it's selected, if I hit the delete key, it takes it away, and I see there's no legend back there. Now I can bring that back just by clicking the undo button, which is a great feature of the program. If I go to edit and undo delete elements, then I bring that back. So as long as you don't save anything once you make that deletion before you bring it back, you're okay. And if you do save, the book is having you save it to your My Exercises folder. So make sure that when you save periodically, be careful that you save it to that folder. If you just click the save button up here on the screen, it's going to save right over top of the original version that you have now. So one of the habits that I try to get into, even though the book might not tell you to save it until later on, usually when I open a project like this that I want to save in a different location, I go ahead and save it right away to that location, so that the program will then basically reset that save to folder to that new location, and then in the future I can just click the save button periodically, not worry about overwriting the original version. So I'm going to do that, and give me just a second here to page through. I'm trying to remember the naming scheme that it has. You save it as, okay. Oh, okay. Now this is another issue in the book, by the way. It's not anything wrong per se, but it's having you save these tutorials with the same name that they're using to open up the original version. And just out of habit, and it would not bother me if you do this, I would put the word my in front of that, so that I could always have a visually differentiate between the tutorial 4-1 and my tutorial 4-1. It's having you save it in the my exercises folder, so technically it is two different files and there's not an issue. But just so I know which one I'm working on, I'm going to save it as my tutorial 4.1. So I'm going to click on the file, go to save as. Be careful not to say save, and because you see when I say save as, it pops up by default the folder where I pulled that original tutorial from. So if I had clicked save, it would have written it right over the top of the original, and then I would have to reinstall the data to get back to the original should something happen that I needed to. And you might want to repeat these exercises and so forth, so there's lots of reasons why you might want to keep the original version. So I'm going to go ahead and route it over to the my exercises folder, and instead of leaving it tutorial 4.1, I'm going to just add the word my tutorial 4.1 to the front of it. And again, I know it's not something the book said, and I hadn't mentioned it previously, but feel free to do that if you want to. I wouldn't get too fancy with the names, just something that's different, just like my tutorial is fine. So I'm going to save that, and then now I saved that as my tutorial, and it's actually still saving here. Let's give it a minute. Okay, now it's saved, and you notice the name changed at the top to my tutorial 4.1, and now I could click the save button at will, and I know it's going to route it to that new folder. So that way it's just a good habit periodically to save your changes as you're working in the program. Even if it doesn't tell you to for a while, I would save it periodically just to be safe. You might decide to stop working on the tutorial in midstream, or something might come up or something, and so every now and then I would just click the save button. So that's one thing I notice, is that the legend is not here, which is not an issue in this case because we're not particularly working on the legends in this exercise anyway. So I'm going to switch back to the data view, and we're back here. And the purpose of this chapter is using the selection features, which, as it points out in the beginning, is a very powerful feature of GIS. When you think of analysis, a lot of times you don't initially think of just selections because that doesn't seem like you're manipulating the data and so forth. But as you've seen in some of the other chapters as well, a lot of analysis per se can be done visually with the program, and that's one of the very powerful things with GIS, is that it lets you not just only manipulate your data, but actually look at your existing data with different viewpoints, so to speak. And so with this chapter, we're selecting features, and we're using other features to select those features. Sometimes it's features that is a graphic that we draw on the screen, or that in this case is already existing on the screen. Or it might be another layer, and you're using polygons or points or lines in another layer to select features in a layer. And so it's a very powerful feature of GIS, and it's something that you'll use probably in your class project quite a bit as well. And that's why I always emphasize that chapter 4 and chapter 5 in this book that's coming up is two of the more important chapters in the book, in my opinion, because they contain procedures that you'll probably use more than any other when you do an analysis and things in GIS. So work through these chapters and then maybe rework through them at another time. And since you're saving it with a different name, um, you've got the original to work with if you ever want to rework through these again. And you can always add to the file name by putting a 2 at the a 1 at the end and a 2 and a 3 and so forth if you want to repeat the exercise for practice. Now I'm going to pause the recording periodically, and so you might see the screen change a little bit from time to time as I talk about some of this, because to save time what I'm doing is I'm actually working through the chapter verbatim just like you're doing, but rather than bore you with every single detail, I'm going to skip around just a little bit and mainly hit the highlights and point out some of the things I wanted you to pay particular attention to, and some things that might not have been mentioned in the book directly. So just one of those would be, I noticed right away when I looked at this project, before I even went very far in the book, I noticed this area that they mentioned that's got the cross hatching in it, where they had drawn in the dashed red line around it, around this part of the neighborhood in this city. And I was looking over at the table of contents over here, and I was looking for in particular this red dashed line to see what it meant, by looking at the legend over here in the table of contents, and I couldn't find it over here, and it was puzzling me for a minute, and I was like, well, I don't see it anywhere over here. And what I realized, and the reason I point this out to you is because you might see this occasionally, whenever we make a graphic on our display, whether it's in data view or layout view. Usually you'll be doing this you could be doing it in either one. But whenever we draw a graphic, which you're not doing per se in this, well, I guess you do a quick one in this exercise, but anyway, a graphic on the screen can look exactly like a shapefile or a geodatabase file or whatever. It can look just like a feature on your screen, and it can be hard to tell the difference visually. And so I wanted to point out that one way of checking for graphics, if graphics exists on your screen, would be like in this area, just right away, just click on it with the left button, and you see the box that pops up. And it has you do that later in the chapter. But I noticed this right away because, again, I couldn't find the cross-hatching in the legend, so it made me suspect there might have been a graphic on there. Now that's an actual graphic that is drawn on the screen, and we're going to use it in the chapter to select features with, which is something you can do. But the graphic itself is not really something that you can analyze, because the GIS program doesn't see it as like georeferenced data per se. It just sees it as a graphic that's been drawn on the screen. We could have drawn any graphic on the screen anywhere. And a lot of times later on in the course and in other situations, you might run into cases where you're puzzled because you can't make a certain feature perform the way you're wanting it to do. And a lot of times it will be because that feature is really just a graphic. It's not a georeference layer in your map. So just keep in mind that the graphics are great for visual effects, and in cases like this to use to select other features with, but the actual analysis on the graphic itself, you're very limited in what you can do, and more importantly, it's very easy to confuse a graphic with a feature. So it's nice to be aware of what graphics you have on your screen, if any, and so that's why I was pointing this out right up front. And notice too, I've got that selected. I can hit the delete key, takes that away, and you can see what the actual layers look like behind it. And this is the actual data that we're seeing on the screen now. And in this case, I can bring that graphic right back by going up to my edit menu and clicking the undo element, and it brings it back. Early in the chapter, it has you switch over to what they call the selectable view here, where the table of contents is. Some of these views are new to ArcGIS 10. I'm myself still getting familiar with them. Some of you that have used ArcGIS 9 in the past probably can relate to that. But this is just different ways of using the table of contents to look at your layers of information. So think of it that way. I like the default view, and I use this most of the time. But it is handy to switch to these others for certain things, and like they're having you do in this chapter. And so you're listing it by the selectable layer when you're looking at these layers, and it consolidates. You have the two layers. It consolidates all the legend down, so you just have two simple layers showing here. And notice the this blue bar telling you what is selectable, and the other one is not selectable. And by default, this exercise already had put the lot boundaries in the not selectable layer and the land use in the selectables. So they tell you to do that, but it's actually already done for you. So just playing around with it a little bit, though. Notice this first button here is it says click to toggle selectable. If I click that again, if I click that again, it becomes selectable once again. And so you want, and the reason they have you do that is because you want to be very careful about what you have set as selectable. If you have both layers set to selectable, in other words, by having both turned on set to selectable, then any actions I perform that select features is going to select features in both layers. Usually you're only wanting to work with one layer at a time. You're wanting to look at just features that get selected in this case in the land use category. So I don't want the lot boundaries selectable. If they were both set to selectable and then I perform the selection, I would get multiple selections, and it can really mess up your visual display at the very least, but it can also give you some incorrect results, or at least some unanticipated results later on. So be very careful with that. Make sure you do have set to selectable the ones you want to select from, and then perform your overlay analysis from that. So what they do in the book, just real quickly, is they have you look at the selected features that are covered within this graphic in two different ways. One, they have you actually draw a graphic on your own, and they point out some problems with that. And then they have you use the graphic that they have already pre-defined for you. So I won't go through the drawing, they have you do that in the book, but when you draw the graphic around this area that's hatched right now, when you draw that manually, you'll find one of the problems they don't point out is that your cursor will be jumping back and forth as you go around it, and that's because it's set by default to what we call snap to other features. So your cursor is jumping over and snapping to other areas, and what can happen is you can end up with more areas selected than what you want. And actually, let me just go ahead and do that real quickly just so you can see that. I'll draw a quick graphic around it, and I'm going to go a little quicker than what you probably would normally, but just to point out, as I'm drawing, see how it's snapping, the cursor is snapping over to areas that are really outside the area that I want, even though I'm trying to be careful when I draw it. And so if I went around this thing drawing it, let me just real quickly jump around here. And you see it's jumping outside the area there. I'm going to double click to finish it. It takes it just a minute to okay, and notice that areas got selected outside the area I wanted, and that's because the snapping feature touched upon those boundaries as I went around, and that caused them to get selected. So one reason for having a very nice detailed graphic that's been carefully drawn outside of this environment is that it gives you more precision over the area that's going to be used to be selected. So we don't want to run our analysis on these. You can see up here the actual selectable results is showing 253, and you remember in the book it wanted 202, so you'll notice that that's incorrect. So what they have you do is clear those selections and then use the graphic to make your selections with. And once I do that, it's already selected. Okay, I can see the boxes around it. And when I go to selection and select by graphics, then again, it takes it a second here, and then it will select just the features inside that graphic. Very nice and neat. It's clipped just to the area that we want, and you see that we have 202 features selected with this method. So also just remember, it noted in the book that to use the select by graphics, you need to be in data view. And some of you that had contacted me, I'm thinking that part of the problem might have been you may have been trying to perform this while you were in the layout view, in which case you might not get the correct results, or it might not work at all for you. So that might be part of the reason. Make sure that you're in data view when you're performing a selection. Really, in general, I can't think of many reasons you want to do a selection while you're in layout view, because your layout view is really just designed to give you a preview of what your printout is going to look like. When you're doing these kinds of analyses and stuff, you want to be in data view. So make sure you are in data view when you perform that. So with our features selected that we want, we can now proceed to perform some of the analysis that we're asked to find for our city council meeting. And notice right away we've got a count here. We know that there are 202 lots that exist within this area. So we've already selected those. So we've got one of the numbers we want. But then we also want to run some of the statistics out of our table, the attribute table that goes with this. Now, if we right-click on the land use layer over here, we've got the option to tell you to open the table showing selected features. And notice too, you can just open the table up here. This open table showing selected features is a new feature of with ArcGIS 10. It's kind of nice because it saves you a step. But just know that when you click that, you're basically opening the whole table, but it's set to view only selected features. And you can tell that by looking at the bottom down here. You see that there's 202 out of this asterisk in front of the 2000 means that there's greater than 2000 records in this data table. And we see that it's this here, if we hover over it, it says show selected records. If we click the one next to it, it would show all of the records, which is what we would have gotten had we just selected the attribute table in that previous step instead of opening the table with selected records. And again, you see we're still showing 202 out of more than 2,000 selected, and they're scattered throughout. You see nothing is highlighted here, but if I carefully drag the bar through here, and I will probably see some of the ones that are selected if they're in that first 2,000. If they're more than that, they might not show up. And notice it jumps. See, it went to 4,000 down here. As I scroll through this table, it will add more records to it. I guess this is a way of saving memory space in the program. It's a little confusing, but if I want to know how many total records were in that table, I could just keep dragging this to the bottom, and you see there's a few selected that are starting to pop up. And as I drag it to the bottom, I then have to let go and wait a minute, and it will refresh the screen, and I can keep doing that until it no longer has any more to refresh. So you notice the bar over here is getting shorter and shorter to the point it's now I can't go down any further, and I don't have the asterisk any longer, and I can see that there were really 13,009 total records there. So there were 13,009 probably lot boundaries, because the land use, by the way, is corresponding to lot boundaries in terms of the boundaries that are in other words, each lot boundary seems to have a land use boundary that's associated with it. And so there are a total of 13,009, and I've selected 202 of those. So let me switch it back to just show the selected records only. And now I'm back in that mode, and so I can scroll through the table, and I'm only going to see 202 of those 13,000 records here because of the way I've got it set. So what they have you do, there's a field in this table that represents the land unit, or I'm sorry, the dwelling units, and it points out that a dwelling unit, has a value of 0 for lots at just commercial lots because there's no residential families there, and it can have a value of 1 or higher depending on what type of housing it is. So here's our dwelling unit field. If I scroll down through there, I can see that there are just ones and zeros here. If I look through it, in theory there could be more than one if it were like an apartment building or such. Like, look, here's one that shows 214, and that's obviously an apartment building of some sort. So what we want to know is what's that value? What's the total number of dwelling units that we have selected? And the way we can get at that is simply through a very nice feature of the program. If we just right click on that field and go to statistics, then we can see that it gives us some summary statistics for that field. We can see that we have a total of 202 selected features, and we have the value in that field ranges from 0, like we saw, which would have been commercial areas, to 214, which would have probably been a large some kind of apartment building or something. That's individual. That's sort of the minimum maximum that they're showing you for that field. What we really want is this field here, this sum, and the sum is showing 633, and so we know there are 633 dwelling units equivalents in that selected area. So that was another number that they wanted, was the 633. And I'm jumping ahead here in the book. And they also wanted to get a total area of all of the parcels as a group. So the way they did that was using statistics again, and they just happened to have an acreage field in this table. Okay, so if we selected that and then right clicked and went to statistics, again we could go in here and see the sum, and that gives us 152.1 something. And that's the number of acres of the selected lots or land use areas that we have selected in that region. So it's 152.1. They also wanted a breakdown of the acres by the type of use code, okay, for the different categories of uses within there, and those could range from like single family to multifamily, duplexes, commercial, and so forth. And the way they did that is we used a feature called the summarize feature. And first we go to the use code, and the use code, if I click on this field and just look down through here where it's highlighted, you can see they're ranging in these values from vacant to F1, which the table later tells us, that F1 is commercial and A1 is single family and so forth. So you can see there are multiple records for each of those. What we want to do is sort of real quickly summarize those by land use. And another great feature of the program is having that summarize button. So if I right click on that, I can go to summarize, and notice that statistics, by the way, is grayed out, and the book didn't mention this, but it's grayed out because that field is not a numeric field. That is a text field. In other words, the use code field doesn't contain numeric numbers in there, so you couldn't run a statistics on it because it's not numerical. So what we're going to do is summarize, and when I click that, it will show us that we have the table wanted us to select a field to summarize on, and use code is selected because that's where we right clicked. We could have switched that. If we look at the drop down, it's showing us some other text type fields in that table that we could use to summarize by. And because we right clicked while we were on the use code field, then it put use code in here by default, which is what we want. And so again, this is what we're going to summarize on, and a lot of times it's helpful to read these dialog boxes real carefully at the top, even though the book is trying to explain some of it to you as well. If we notice, summarize creates a new table. Okay, it's going to create a new table for us that contains one record for each unique value of the selected field. So in other words, for each vacancy, it's going to go through and tally all those up and make a table that only has one record for vacancy. And it's going to do that with each of the codes in here. So it's going to get each unique code. If there were 50 unique codes scattered throughout those 202, we'd have a table with 50 records in it. And in this case, we're going to end up with a table with about 6 in it, looks like. And so it summarizes those based on the selected field along with the statistics that summarize any of the other fields that we choose. Okay, and so that's what we see in this next drop down, and these are the numerical type fields. Okay, these are fields that have numerical kinds of data that we could have gotten individual statistics for as a whole, but in this case we're going to get statistics in a summarized fashion based on the use code. Okay, hopefully it's not too confusing. It was for me when I first started doing this, but hopefully that explanation helps and doesn't make it worse. So what we are really interested in out of this for the statistics is only the acreage. So we're going to click the little drop down by acreage here, and these are the types of statistics just like we saw before when we were running the totals. We could get statistics for any of these types of statistics here. So we want sum because we want a total. We want the total acreage for each of the use code fields. And that's all we have to do for that. Then the table, now by default, and this is something that you see over and over again with ArcGIS, it by default wants to put anything new that it creates into your users and your basically your My Documents subfolder. And 9 times out of 10 you don't want it to go there. In this case, we want our results to go to the My Exercises folder that we have created. So you always have to remember to change this, or it will stick it in this sort of remote location and you might not easily be able to find it. So let's reroute this basically using the browse button. We're going to reroute this to go to our My Documents folder instead. Not our My Documents, our My Exercises folder. So we'll go to the Esri Press and the GIST2 and the My Exercises. And then it wanted us to put those in the land use summary. So we're going to type land use summary since we have a land use report, but we don't have a land use summary. We'll put land use summary. Okay, and it doesn't tell us to change this, so it's basically going to put it into it wants to put it into a geodatabase, and you can see that I have an error that pops up, and so that's because it's trying to create a geodatabase with this, and because it's wanting to put it's basically wanting to put this as I've got it set here. And this is, I guess, another glitch in the chapter in a way, because he doesn't really tell you or differentiate. But if I just click save here, now that I'm in the My Exercises folder, I'm going to get an error because it's trying to save it as a geodatabase. And I basically have to create a geodatabase to save it into before it can do that. So it's trying to save it as a table within a geodatabase. I'm sorry. So I can either pick one of my geodatabases and then click save, or I could change the type here to just a database table. So in this case, I'm just going to pick a database table. Now, you could have done this either way, but if I pick a geodatabase, then it will save it within that geodatabase. And all I'm wanting here is just a summarized report. So I don't see a particular need to put it within the geodatabase, and in truth I don't use the geodatabase feature a whole lot anyway, because I kind of like being able to see all of my separate tables real easily without having to dig into the geodatabase. There are some pros and cons of using it though, as you've seen already going through the exercises, but in this case what I'm going to do, I'm just going to change this to a dbase table, and notice it adds the .dbf extension to it, and then I can say save, and it will let me save it, and then to see the results. Okay, to see the results, I first want to make sure that I've got summarize on selected records only checked. That way it performs it just on that 202 set of records, and by default it sets that for me. So we'll say OK and let it run, and it asks me if I want to add the table to the map, and let's say yes. And I can go ahead and close the original table that I did the analysis on. Now I don't see the results yet over here because I'm just set to the selectable uh, mode to show my list by layers that are selected, and we really didn't even create another layer here. We created a table. And if I go back to the original view to show the drawing order, I don't see it there neither, because again, this is just showing me the layers in my project. So what I want to do is I want to click the list by source button, and when I do that, I can see I have the two layers, and I also have down here the table, and you can tell by the icon it shows you its little table icon. And notice the location, it shows me the path of where this is stored. The other two layers are stored out there in the original data location that the program or that your data set came with, and it's showing this one separately because I saved it to the My Exercises folder, and it shows a table there. So I can right click on that and say open, and then there I see my table that shows that I have actually, it's 6 records, and they always start with 0 for the first record for some reason. But it shows the different land use codes. It shows a count of each code. So in other words, vacancy occurred 33 times. 33 of that 202 lots were vacant lots. Okay, and the total acreage for those was 48.5. So I can real easily now report back the acreages by the land use category, and I can also tell how many lots there were in each of those categories, because it gives me a nice count. Even though I didn't ask for that, it automatically gives me that. Okay, so that's handy to have. Now I want to add this table that I just had open basically to the layout view in the last step. So what I'm going to do, first I'm going to clear my selections. Okay, I've got those selected. Let's just clear those so they won't show up as selected in my layout. And unless I wanted them to show up, I guess I could. And so here I'm in layout view, and I want to add, it tells you to add a table, but conveniently it doesn't tell you how to do that. And I think that's where a lot of people were having some issues. So let me show you how to do that. So to add a table to the layout, there's a couple ways I could do this. One, I could just draw a table in there, but then I would have to type in all the values and enter that. And basically I'd be making a graphic within my layout and designing my own table. But there's a quick way of getting a table in. If I go back to the data view, and we're still under the list by source, so I'm going to open my table again. Okay, and once that's open, what I can do is in the little options box here in the table options, if I click the drop down, there is an item in there near the bottom to add the table to the layout. Okay, if I click that, then my view automatically switches to layout, and I can see that it stuck a copy of my table in the layout. So I'm going to drag it over here by the legend area, and notice the bounding rectangle is larger than I want, and it's probably because the table was opened in that larger window. But regardless, I can make it smaller without affecting the size of the table by drawing the box up tighter around where the table is. Then I can drag and drop it wherever I want to. And so that has that set. Now notice here on my table, it's got those two fields that I wanted plus the land use field. Now I had changed yours might be showing an OID number. If I go back and open the table again, I hid let me unhide because I did this while I was not recording. Let's see, hang on just a minute. I had hid the OID field, and let me turn it back on by turning all fields on. And this is what your table looks like originally, and that's what you should have. But you can hide anything you don't want to show up in the table when you put it in the layout. You can hide that by basically right clicking on that field. In this case, the OID is a number that's inherent into ArcGIS, and it's using it for its tracking purposes. So I don't really want that in my layout, so I'm going to right click and say turn field off. that changes my layout. The data is still there, it's just being hid from view. And then if I go in and add that to my layout, then I get the table without the OID field in it. And then to get that back, when I go back to my open my table again, if I want that to show up, which usually you do when you're just looking at your data and you're not really wanting it in layout, then I can turn the fields on and it will come back on. And that way I keep it nice and clean in my layout. Now, another advantage of adding a table to the layout using this method is that it is live linked. It's basically live linked to that table. So if for some reason, let me zoom in on my table, if for some reason my numbers were to change later, I were to edit my data and I had more units and I rerun my analysis to get the results, then this would be live linked in my layout. It would automatically update the count in the sum fields for me, so I wouldn't have to recreate that again each time. So that's another advantage of doing it that way rather than drawing a table in there by hand. So that's exercise 4.1, and